Okay, this screencast is going to pick up with the treaty that ends the Spanish-American War, and that is once again going to be a Treaty of Paris. This is going to be the Treaty of Paris 1898, signed by representatives from both Spain and the United States. There are going to be 3 stipulations within this treaty. Number 1, Cuba will gain independence from Spain, but they will remain under American government control for some time after this war, so they're not fully independent, and we'll kind of elaborate on that a little bit more. Secondly, Spain will be giving away Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. We're going to say that they ceded Guam. Ceded is with C-E-D-E-D. So they're ceding Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S., giving that territory to us. And then the third stipulation is that Spain is actually going to sell the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. So we have control of Cuba. We actually possess Puerto Rico and Guam. And we are going to buy the Philippines from Spain. Now, it may seem weird that we have to pay Spain for the Philippines since we defeated them in the Philippines, but perhaps Spain would be willing to fight longer over this cause, and, our main conflict was in the Caribbean, so that's probably also why they give us extra territory, such as Guam, that had nothing really to do with the Cuban conflict. So all in all, we do walk away with a lot of territory, which is in part of our imperialistic vision for the country. We're going to talk about Puerto Rico first. We're going to kind of elaborate on these, there goes the door. We're going to elaborate on these new territories the U.S. is kind of coming to acquire as a result of the Spanish-American War. So Puerto Rico wanted to be independent from Spain and from the United States. Puerto Rico did not want to be initially occupied by the United States, but the U.S. felt that Puerto Rico was kind of geographically important to the United States for several reasons, mainly to kind of maintain an influence in the Caribbean. So the U.S. will eventually kind of make Puerto Rico a Commonwealth country of the U.S., and this basically kind of means that they will be able to kind of have their own government, but that the overall U.S. government kind of oversees the government within Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans actually can be drafted into the military, which seems a little unfair considering they can't send representatives, or they can't vote for representatives or for the president in elections. They are allowed to send representatives to Congress to kind of like represent their interests, but they don't actually get to vote in those types of law-making decisions. Now, as a Commonwealth country, the citizens of Puerto Rico are considered U.S. citizens, and they can move freely in between the island and the United States, okay? I know that they've had a vote multiple times in terms of becoming a state, but they have voted against it in most scenarios, fearing to lose any sort of Latin culture, which is of course understandable. I think that it'll be interesting to kind of see the dynamic with with Puerto Rico over the coming years after the kind of aftermath of the hurricane that hit this fall, really, I guess. Okay, we're going to now talk about the Cuban relationship. There are going to be 2 amendments that were passed that are amendments to 2 different things as well, but are going to kind of affect our relationship with Cuba, and it'll change the dynamic. So the Teller Amendment is going to be something that was added to our declaration of war against Spain. Cuba is very fearful that the U.S. would try to completely annex it after the Spanish-American War. We have not annexed Cuba. We maintain control of Cuba as part of the Treaty of Paris, but we did not actually annex it. But before the war was over, and actually officially even really gotten into things, a U.S. Senator, Teller, added an amendment that basically said Cuba would eventually be given its independence. So the Teller Amendment led Cubans to believe that once the war was over, Cuba would be independent, but that's just not the case. Again, we're not annexing it, but we don't completely leave. We pretty much still control them. But we also provide for them at this time, but that's not making them very happy still. Eventually, the Platt Amendment was added to the Cuban Constitution, which officially kind of established the relationship we would have with Cuba. It basically said that if Cuba ever became unstable, we would have the right to intervene and kind of help, and that we would be a protectorate of Cuba, and we would, get some control over their economy, but that we would provide for them in return. And then Cuba also was kind of forced to lease harbors to us for naval bases, kind of something similar we wanted in, with Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. We're going to use Guantanamo Bay in Cuba as a naval base. So that is our current relationship with Cuba. So we never officially annexed them, but we also don't fully leave them alone. Kind of an unofficial possession of Cuba, and that will change in the decades to come. Now, the Filipinos flat out feel betrayed in terms of the U.S. annexing and purchasing the Philippines from Spain. We are not willing to let go of this potential Asian kind of influence at this point in history. But the Filipinos will essentially rebel against the U.S. government. We freed them from Spanish control, but then we stayed and purchased them. Now they're rebelling against us. This is a actually long rebellion. It took about 3 years to put down, and it cost thousands of U.S. lives and over $400 million. So we actually sent and spent more money on this, putting down this rebellion, than we did on purchasing it to begin with. So it's 20 times the amount of money spent that we paid for it, which is just kind of crazy. We do eventually put down the rebellion completely. What's kind of interesting is that of the several thousand troops that were sent to the Philippines, many of them were African American. And when they kind of saw how we were treating the Filipinos, with kind of like a racial and ethnic, as inferiors to us, they kind of sympathized with them, and they kind of, some of them actually refused to fight and form like bonds and relationships with the Filipino people. But eventually, like I said, we do put the rebellion down. After all the money and lives were spent, we're going to set up a government very similar to Puerto Rico. The president would have the right to appoint a governor who would kind of be in charge of U.S. affairs in the Philippines. But eventually, in the mid-1900s, we are going to completely liberate the Philippines, and they're going to become an independent country again. Okay, so we kind of went over the treaty and then how we are handling our relationship with Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. Please write down any questions you have, and we'll pick up with our relationship in Asia in class tomorrow. I hope you have a good evening.